Has the idea of karma actually benefited Western practitioners, or has it just been misunderstood and led to abuse and manipulation amongst different Western spiritual communities? This is the issue we're going to be looking at in today's video. I hope that you enjoy it, and if you do, please make sure to like the video and to subscribe to the channel. Thank you. I thought this concept of karma and looking at the concept of karma and the way that it's understood by Western practitioners would be kind of an interesting subject for the video today, because I've seen, as I'm sure many people who have been part of large spiritual communities have seen, this concept just really not only misunderstood but even abused and used to manipulate people, used as a sales tactic for different techniques, saying, well, this technique burns the most karma, and another teacher says, well, my technique burns the most karma. And then one person tries to manipulate a love interest and say, well, our karmas are tied together, we were together in past lives. And I've just seen this concept, which on the surface seems like it should be a really beautiful and harmless philosophic teaching. I've seen it really abused by Western practitioners and in Western spiritual communities. So that is kind of what gave rise to this video, is seeing it abused in such a way made me think, is it really, should we still be talking about karma as Westerners? You know, should Westerners really be working with a concept that I think is still very foreign to them in a lot of ways? And I think it is that foreignness of it, the fact that it's an interesting or kind of novel approach to explaining life. But very few Westerners in today's world were actually raised within a setting that took the traditional teachings of karma very seriously. Very few Western practitioners, I at least for my part have never met a Western practitioner who actually lived observing the teachings of karma in Hindu philosophy or Buddhist philosophy the way that a native-born Buddhist or Hindu does. And I think that this ends up leading to a lot of misunderstanding and abuse of the concept. So I thought this would be kind of an interesting thing to look at, is despite how ingrained into pop culture and modern spirituality the concept of karma has become, is it something that we should maybe pull back from a little bit as Western practitioners and just acknowledge it's a little bit of a foreign concept to us. It may not be the best way of framing a worldview, and that because of that it ends up lending to some misuse and abuse amongst spiritual communities, as well as some pretty grievous misunderstandings in people's own personal practices and how they understand different kinds of spiritual practices. Now, the theory of karma has enjoyed a level of popularity as a philosophic position or religious belief that I think probably very few spiritual teachings have ever enjoyed worldwide. Kind of beginning in the 20th century, it just kind of exploded throughout the world and was adopted very quickly and readily by Western practitioners who were becoming more and more interested in Oriental practices and teachings as those teachings became more available to Western audiences, were translated out of Sanskrit and Tibetan and Chinese and so on and so forth. This idea ended up becoming very appealing to a lot of Westerners who were feeling a little bit separated from the classical values of Western culture, Western religious beliefs and philosophies. And because of that, the Oriental views and teachings, I think, were kind of very appealing to them. Now, karma has a really wonderful practical appeal to many Western practitioners. It's intuitive, it seems very natural. You can't really deny the fact of cause and effect in regular life. And because of that, it's not too hard to try to extend that even beyond to some of these metaphysical levels of belief and philosophic reasoning. And it's not, you know, this concept of cause and effect, dependent origination, things like that is not something that's particularly Oriental. I don't think any philosophy in the world has really ever formally and forcibly denied the possibility of cause and effect, at least not within spiritual and religious traditions. But for the Western audience, which was kind of pulling away from a lot of traditional Western religious beliefs, the idea that you could still believe in something like fate, that you could have a concept of fate or of destiny, which tends to be very important for people for some reason. It tends to be part of just human psychology. We really like this idea that we're destined to do things, that certain things are fated, that we're here for a purpose. You know, all these things tend to mean a lot for us. And removed from normal Western religious ideas where there is a supreme deity who has set in stone what that purpose is, karma ends up being a very viable and very attractive alternative to that, where there is a sense of destiny or purpose, but it's something that you yourself have largely been the artificer of over many, many lifetimes of actions and intents and desires and goals you've tried to achieve and lessons you're trying to learn. And to some extent, it puts a little bit more power on the individual. And to some extent, it removes power from the individual, because the person's individual karma is seen as being affected by the karma of everything and every person around them. So it's a very, I think, appealing concept. It allows us to have this belief in fate or in destiny, but without the belief in an all-supreme deity, the way that the Western religions tend to present such a deity. And this has become such a popular concept that in pop culture and in modern spirituality, that even in English dictionaries, the word karma can now be found. And one of the things that I think we need to look at is, despite all of that, despite how much popularity it's enjoyed, there still seems to be a tremendous amount of misunderstanding in Western culture and by Western spiritual practitioners what karma is, because I think in a lot of ways the kind of pop culture understanding of karma is not at all what the classic philosophic stances and religious teachings of karma are. Karma is actually on its own quite a strong philosophic stance with a lot of its own proofs and reasonings within its traditions. There's lengthy discourses written on it by Buddhist philosophers and by Indian philosophers. Whereas in pop culture, it's just become a kind of, novel way of explaining what goes around comes around, and it ends up being misused and abused quite a bit in that regards, because people end up becoming often the prisoner, in a way, a kind of psychological prisoner to this idea, just as much as they would any other idea or philosophy of fate and of destiny. One of the ways that I think this concept has kind of suffered at the hands of Western practitioners and misunderstanding is the ethical dimension of karma seems to have been almost completely removed from it, which is strange because it seems like it should be primarily in ethical teaching. But it ends up becoming this kind of weird, obscure power with a certain value in it that binds you to the world. And if you go and you sit in a lot of different Western workshops, or even Oriental teachers who are teaching a largely Western audience, it ends up being a bit of a sales technique to try to say, well, this technique burns the most karma, this one doesn't burn too much karma, these kinds of traditional practices don't really burn any karma, these ones just make more karma. And a lot of Western practitioners get stuck in this really weird idea that some things in life are going to create more karma for them, and some things in life are going to create less karma for them. And the issue is you don't really see that evaluation system in all of the traditional literature. Instead, you see a very ethical focus on these teachings of karma. And so I'm going to read for you here, or reference for you here, a few very early references to karma. Two of these are scriptures from the Buddha, from the Tripitaka, and one of them is the earliest mention that I could find in Vedic literature of the concept of karma, which is by the great Rishi Yajnavalkya in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. And so first I want to look at the Saleyyaka Sutta, which is in chapter 1, verse 5, and these are the teachings of the Buddha to a group of householders, talking to them about conduct and about karma, the reactions or the consequences of their actions. And he says, "It is by reason of unrighteous conduct not in accordance with the Dharma, that some beings here, upon the breakup of the body, upon death, are reborn in a state of misery, in a bad destination, in the lower world, and in hell. It is by reason of righteous conduct in accordance with the Dharma, that some beings here, upon the breakup of the body, upon death, are reborn in a good destination and in a heavenly world." Now, one of the things I find so fascinating about this particular quote is if you remove the concept of reincarnation from it, this would agree perfectly with the ethical parameters of Western religion, right? and general or classical Western monotheistic tradition, whether it be Judaism, Christianity, Islam. It's the same concept that your actions have consequences that go even beyond your physical death, and that upon death you will experience the results of the consequences of your actions. And if you did good, virtuous things throughout your life, there's going to be a reward, even the mention of a heavenly world, of going to heaven. And if you do bad things and invirtuous deeds during your life, then you're going to go to a worse place, or like the Buddha himself here even says, go to hell, right? And so this to me, when I read this, it struck me as being very contrary to the way that karma is generally spoken of by a lot of modern spiritual teachers, especially when they're teaching Westerners. Because it really doesn't have anything to do with that quantifying of karma. Instead, it's dealing with karma along very ethical lines, and as a kind of forceful religious teaching, with this force of motivating you to do good, giving you reasons to be good, and giving you reasons to avoid doing bad things. If we look at the Culakammavibhanga Sutta in part 3, verse 19, I'm not going to quote the whole thing here. In fact, I'm just going to kind of summarize the basic idea. Here we get more of the concept of dependent origination in Buddhism. These again are the words of the Buddha that I think appeals a little bit more. This is the more classic concept of karma that I think people find very appealing. But again, we don't really actually see this playing as big a role in the way that it's presented today. And in this particular verse, the Buddha is describing karma as a simple chain of cause and effect that would fit in with any modern day teachings about these things. That if you want to live a long life, you need to live a way of life that leads to long life. If you live a way of life that leads to a short life, then you'll be short-lived. If you live a way of life that leads to sickness, you'll be sickly. If you lead a way of life that leads to health, you'll be healthy. A way of life that leads to ugliness will make you ugly. A way of life that leads to beauty will make you beautiful. A way of life that makes you uninfluential will make you uninfluential. Living a way of life that makes you more influential will make you influential, right? And so on and so forth, kind of ultimately saying a way of life that leads to ignorance will make you ignorant, and a way of life that leads to wisdom, or a way of life that is full of wisdom, will eventually make you wise. So this seems to be a little bit more how we tend to understand it. But again, the interesting thing there is it's largely along ethical lines, and it's just simple cause and effect. It's very commonplace. It makes sense, right? If you want to be rich, you need to do things that make you some money. If you want to be healthy, you need to do things that bring you some health. And then in the Vedic teachings, the earliest, there tends to be some kind of agreement here that in the Upanishads we get the earliest mention of karma in Vedic tradition. And it's in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, and it's associated with the sage Yajnavalkya. And here we see, again, kind of a very simple ethical teaching, taking it as a kind of prototypal form of karma. And here Yajnavalkya says in chapter 4, verse 5, as a person acts, so they become in life. Those who do good become good. Those who do harm become bad. Good deeds make one pure. Bad deeds make one impure. You are what your deep driving desire is. As your desire is, so is your will. As your will is, so is your deed. As your deed is, so is your destiny. And here we have a little bit more emphasis on the intent, the purpose of your actions, which ends up becoming one of the defining features of the concept of karma in Hindu tradition. That if you read the Bhagavad Gita, you read through the Upanishads, you read some of the later tantric literature, such as Abhinavgupta and others who go at length to talk about karma, you see there's a lot of emphasis put on this concept of intent. What is the actual intent? And the relationship of karma in the Vedic traditions tends to be that if one has the right intent, which is to be completely unattached to the results of your actions, then your karma simply works itself out without creating new karma. So these are some of the classic understandings of the way karma is taught within these cultures. And I think one of the issues is when karma now pops up in modern spirituality, even when it's Indian or Buddhist teachers coming to the West and teaching Western students, we don't get that really at all. And instead, karma is just this bad thing that you need to get out of. And all the practices are kind of marketed as having more or less power to deliver you from that karma. And this ends up kind of robbing and depriving this really beautiful theory and philosophy of karma from its classic ethical grounding and dimensions, where there's a lot of emphasis on virtue. And some of this may even be Eastern teachers intentionally changing the way that they're teaching because of the fact that Westerners have misunderstood this concept. And so in order to continue to appeal to Westerners, they need to teach these techniques and present their teachings in a way that agrees with the kind of general Western misunderstanding of what karma is. Another interesting difference between how it appears Western practitioners understand karma compared to Oriental practitioners and Indian practitioners is that, at least in my own experience, when I've been around, like when I was in India in some of the villages, and especially when I spent time around Tibetan, born and raised Tibetan Buddhists, they have a respect for karma that can only be understood as being something akin to the Western concept of fear of God. Okay? And what I find interesting is that when Western practitioners have this concept of karma or follow this philosophy of karma, they have a somewhat godless way of doing it. Right? They do it almost as though heaven is empty, right? As though there's no God there, everything is just cause and effect. And they don't really seem to care too much about the implications of the cause and effect. It's more of just gets used when it's useful, and it doesn't get used when it would be inconvenient. Whereas when you see people who this concept is part of their culture, they were raised with it, they have a profound belief in it, they have a respect for karma that is like this concept of a fear of God. I mean, I've seen a Tibetan go pale in the face at the thought that they may have just created negative karma on accident. Right? I mean, pale in the face and shaking, right? Like just definitely disturbed about it in a way that I've never seen any Westerner even come near to considering karma to be such a powerful force. So I think that part of this disconnect is just because most Westerners, we weren't raised with it, right? We weren't raised with this concept. It didn't play a part of how our brains formed. It hasn't been a deciding factor in many of our life decisions. I've never seen a Westerner, no matter how long-term practitioner they were, I've never seen a Western practitioner make any kind of life decision based on karma. Right. Whereas in the Orient and in India, it's very common. You see this especially with astrology, because astrology, especially Indian astrology, Vedic astrology, has its roots in helping to explain karma. That's one of the purposes of astrology, is to help understand your karma. And in classic Indian society, even your marriages and what job you may take or not take will end up being strongly influenced, even decided based on your astrology, because it's understood that that's part of your karma. And you're just never going to see a Westerner decide, you know, oh, I'm not going to be with you, or we're not going to be in a relationship because our astrology charts don't match, right? That's just not how we live. We like to believe we have a tremendous amount of free will. Whether we actually do or not is a different matter. But because of this, it keeps us from taking this concept of karma as seriously as someone born and raised in that culture might take it. And because of this, it kind of, you know, has to beg the question, does karma then really remain a worthwhile or useful concept for Western practitioners if we don't get the ethical benefits of it, of our belief in it driving our attempt to be good and to avoid doing bad? If we don't take that as seriously, and we don't follow the dictates of karma or treat life as though karma has any role in the life decisions that we make in terms of astrology and things out of our control, are we really benefiting much from having this concept, or is it just lending itself to not only misunderstanding but possibly even abuse, which is what I want to look at next, is not just some of the nice things about karma, but actually I want to look at how, in my own experiences in different Western communities, I've seen this concept actually used to manipulate people, control people, even when sometimes the best intentions were there, and always just because of ridiculous misunderstandings. And so that's what I want to look at next. So there are three ways I've seen this concept of karma abused by Western practitioners and Western spiritual communities. The first way is I've seen it be used to manipulate people into relationships. And I've actually, as strange as this may sound, if you haven't been a part of large communities, you maybe haven't have seen this. I have seen this dozens of times. I mean, it makes me sick how many times I've seen this. So I've seen karma, the first way I've seen karma get used, the concepts of karma used to manipulate people into relationships. I've seen many times karma get used as a scapegoat to explain away all bad behavior. And thirdly, I see it get used all the time amongst even some of the most prominent spiritual teachers right now in the world as a marketing tool to kind of market different practices as being more powerful or less powerful, or to say why you should learn our practices instead of learn those people's practices, so on and so forth. And the first of these I want to look at for a minute here. So what I mean by using karma to manipulate someone romantically is it is somewhat ridiculous the number of times I have seen a more experienced student within a particular spiritual group, just meaning that maybe they've been part of the group for 10, 15 years, they have some practice behind them. And unfortunately, often it's a man. And then they use their position and their so-called spiritual experience to manipulate generally a woman in the group who is nowhere near as experienced into believing that they have some kind of past life karma together, right? That they have some kind of special connection that comes from a previous life. And this is this weird blending of karma with a concept that is really totally foreign to karma, which is one of soulmates. Really, it doesn't matter strictly from the perspective of karmic philosophy in India and in Buddhism. Really, it doesn't matter if you were married with someone in a previous life. Okay, that doesn't have any import as to whether or not you should be with them in this life. Okay, in fact, if anything, it lends credence to the idea that you should be moving on to different experiences in this life instead of repeating things from a previous life. Otherwise, you're not learning. And the whole purpose of karma is for the soul to learn, develop, and evolve. But strangely enough, again, partly because it's just the misunderstanding Westerners have about karma, they don't really realize this mechanism of it. I see men, generally, manipulating women by convincing them that they have some kind of past life connection. Usually, in my experience, the woman is way out of the guy's league. and so for some reason, the guy has to resort to this weird quasi-metaphysical explanation for why they should be together, instead of just taking the girl on a date and seeing if he can win her over the old classic way. So this is the first way I've really seen this concept abused. And I've seen it taken to some pretty sick levels. And then, like I said, the second way is just this weird tendency to use karma as a scapegoat for all bad behavior, which doesn't make any sense to me because, like I said, and like I demonstrated earlier with our references, that the earliest teachings of karma are primarily ethical in their origin, have a very ethical dimension to them. So to try to excuse bad behavior and just being a bad person, like to make an excuse for bad character by saying that it was all karma, or that everything that happened was just karma and everything went to crap because that was the karma of it. Well, probably not. I mean, with the mechanisms of karma, you may have made a lot of bad karma as a result of the whole dumpster fire you just caused. But more than not, if you really look at everything that happened, you'll probably find there's a lot of perfectly explainable reasons why things didn't work out that well and why everything fell apart. So it's a little strange to me how, again, karma is this, at the root of karma is this idea that, like in the quote I gave from the Buddha earlier, the actions that you're doing are going to lead to the kind of life that you're in. There's this direct relationship between your actions and the consequences. And so to separate your actions from the consequences and say that, well, I did this, but, then everything went out of control and went real bad, so it was karma. It seems like this weird separation of cause and effect that actually goes against the basic assumption of the teachings of karma. And this is especially bad when I see spiritual teachers do this. I see spiritual teachers explain away inappropriate conduct towards students, inappropriate conduct towards other teachers, inappropriate management of their businesses, fraud and all kinds of ridiculous things. And spiritual teachers explain it away as just karma and the winds of karma, and or some kind of karmic test for the disciples. And no, karma was never meant to be an excuse for bad behavior. Okay? that has to be understood. It's not an excuse for bad behavior. It's actually the exact opposite. It's supposed to be a motive for good behavior. And if you actually do believe in karma, you'll do everything you can to behave well, to have good character and good conduct. And then this last issue of karma being used as a kind of sales technique. This is just something that in particular troubles me. I don't know how much of a problem it's actually caused, but it does trouble me because I see students get really neurotic about this kind of idea, like how much karma have they burned. And there's no number system on karma. You can't say, well, this technique burns 20 karma, and this technique burns 50 karma, and this technique burns 10,000 karma, so go do this technique. That doesn't really make any sense. None of the teachings on karma validate that approach at all in any tradition, whether it's Buddhist tradition, Hindu tradition, Jain tradition. The most you see is a concept of transcending karma, or to act in a way that doesn't create karma. The whole idea of burning karma is a fairly recent event. It may be, a few hundred years old in some of the Indian tantric traditions. I haven't found any proof of that. But this whole idea that of transforming karma into a quantity, into a value, and then now ranking different spiritual practices according to what their value is in terms of how much karma they can get rid of, just seems insane to me. I mean, it seems like a really weird way to manipulate people into thinking that what you're teaching is the best, and what you can, what your techniques are the best. And all the different teachers now, they seem to be doing this, no matter how popular they are or no matter how traditional they are. And I do think that some spiritual practices, it's just empirical, talking from my own experience and from the experience of many other practitioners, that there are some practices when you do them, it seems like life speeds up a little bit. It seems like the amount of hardship you might experience in a year maybe now comes out in a week or two. And be that as it may, I still don't think that allows for the kind of weird karmic monetary system that has been set up amongst different spiritual groups and spiritual teachings today. Because I think, again, it can just lend, even inadvertently, to a kind of manipulation of students who may have the best intents and they really want to learn the best techniques. And then this grading system is being presented for techniques that can really get in the way, because now students are jumping from teacher to teacher to teacher and method to method to method because they just want to get the one that burns the most karma, and this guy is saying this, and that teacher is saying this, and she's teaching this over there. And they don't end up settling down anywhere, and they become really confused. They don't know what the best technique is. And I think the whole idea of a theoretical best technique is kind of silly on its own. And I think it just ends up causing more strife than help. So I think this issue of the role of karma in amongst Western practitioners and in Western spiritual communities is a fairly important problem to look at. I think it's worth discussion, and I think it's worth further discussion. We'll probably do a number of videos here on the channel about it, looking at it from different perspectives, because I think that if Western practitioners are not going to adopt the entirety of the theory and philosophy of karma, including its ethical and moral dimensions, then we are going to just render the entire thing somewhat useless, and possibly even make it prone to be abused and to lead to different forms of manipulation amongst different spiritual communities and by spiritual leaders. And if that's going to be the case, we might as well just leave it where it is and not really make it an important part of our psyche or our worldview as Western practitioners. There are other ways, other venues or avenues for us to look, such as in Platonic philosophy, Stoic philosophy, or traditional Western religious concepts that can give us plenty enough of a worldview and reason to be good, to do good, and to understand that there are negative consequences to bad actions and positive consequences to good actions, without having to instead cherry pick and kind of cut up into pieces a very beautiful Eastern concept, and in the process of cherry picking and removing it from its culture, render it from its normal beautiful state into something kind of strange and foreign, so that now it really has no home. It's a foreign concept to Westerners, and the way that Westerners pursue it would seem very strange and foreign to the Hindu and Buddhist cultures that it originates in. And I think that kind of view of karma isn't really useful for anybody. So I would say that Westerners need to be thinking about whether or not should we accept the entirety of karmic teachings and philosophy into our worldview, or instead should we maybe work with a worldview that does not seem as foreign to us. So hopefully you've enjoyed this video. I thought it would be kind of an interesting subject, and I look forward to our next video.